Someone who has game planned some of this to an extent is Georgia Gilholy, reporter with politics.co.uk. Georgia, thank you for your time. You've written yesterday about some of these possibilities. Now that Johnson did secure the victory, but by a much lower percentage than many people expected, and a much lower percentage than he would have felt comfortable with. For anyone, Georgia, who hasn't yet had the benefit of seeing what you've written, what do you think happens next?
So, I mean, there's a plurality of things that could go on, and obviously we're sort of in unprecedented times in many ways.
We always are these days, aren't we, it seems?
Yeah, unfortunately. I mean, makes for exciting reading maybe, but not necessarily always living through it.
Yes.
So, of course, one option could be that the Prime Minister resigns following this vote. That seems very unlikely just because of what we know sort of about Boris Johnson's character. We know that he's done worse in terms of support from his MPs or MPs rebelling against him in this no confidence vote, compared to sort of previous leadership challenges and no confidence votes faced by Theresa May, faced by John Major, faced by Margaret Thatcher. But obviously he's a very different breed to those people, has a very different attitude. He seems like the kind of Prime Minister who really wants to cling on to staying in number 10 as long as possible. Of course, another option is that the 1922 committee, which its rules actually aren't publicly available, but we sort of know through different sources that basically they're quite open to change if people on that committee are in favour of changing them. We know that many of the MPs who hold authority in the committee are, I would say, Boris Johnson skeptics or people that have publicly criticised him.
Well, that's interesting because we do know, or at least we think, don't we, and it seems to be taken as read, that there is a 12-month immunity for Johnson from this mechanism once again, as things stand, according to the current rules. So that bit appears to be known. But what you're saying is that the behind the scenes, if enough MPs made enough noise, the 22 might be open to reducing that period of immunity, shall we say?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is that 12-month sort of period in the current rules. However, they are open to change from what we know. And in January, it was reported that they debated changing them. And so we, of course, have two by-elections coming up on the same day, 23rd of June, in just about 2 weeks' time. One in Wakefield, a big red wall constituency, then one in Tiverton and Honiton, a sort of rural constituency that could be taken by the Lib Dems. If the Conservatives perform poorly, if there are other concerns that sort of snowball and more MPs begin to speak up again against Johnson, it could be that the committee decided to then change the rules. It's not as if they'd probably, change them next week if nothing has changed, because they sort of need to appear to have a justification to do so, but it's definitely a possibility. And I think now that we know so many MPs are against Johnson, possibly even because, of course, it's a secret ballot, possibly even ministers voted against him on Monday, and we don't know who they are. So it's either that or it's 75% of his backbenchers voted against him, none of which are good things if you're sitting in Boris Johnson's position. It's possible that a further no-confidence vote could go over that line where to push Johnson from office, or it could be just graver, worse numbers that would build the pressure on him to resign.
Okay. Well, he won't resign, as you've outlined, because of the person that he is, certainly. But you can imagine, can't you, a situation in which the 1922 committee do change the rules and Johnson decides to unilaterally declare that change to be invalid and simply to ignore the result of any subsequent no-confidence vote. I mean, you can imagine Johnson prompting a constitutional crisis within his own party.
Yeah, I think it's unlikely he would, let's say, ignore the results of a vote if it did get above that line of number of MPs, that the exact number escapes me now, but I think it's about 30 more than voted against him on Monday, him ignoring that. However, I think what could happen is, let's say there was another no-confidence vote and Johnson did similar to how he did today, or maybe a little bit worse, maybe a little bit better. He could call a snap election. I know that on Monday he did appear to rule that out when he was speaking to Sky News after the vote. However, Theresa May, of course, ruled out a snap election several years ago and then did hold one in June 2017, which didn't necessarily go as well as she thought it would do. It's an interesting time in the polls for the Conservatives that obviously believe about 11 points behind Labour nationally as it stands. it could be a risky move.
Well, exactly. I asked Peter Robon about this yesterday and say, what am I missing? I don't understand why, even as a threat, do what you're told, or I will call an election and you will lose your seat, could ever be considered a winning point for Boris Johnson, because that would be evidence, A, of his failure, and B, a reduction in his majority and his mandate to stay in number 10. So where did this general election idea come from? It doesn't seem to make any sense on any level to me.
Yeah, and so we actually heard last week two Tory MPs revealed to Bloomberg that there were already discussions prior to this no confidence vote about a possible early election. It's interesting you say, and of course, if an election were held today or tomorrow possibly, many of those red wall MPs would probably lose their seats. However, if there was a Tory majority, even if it was a reduced Tory majority, Johnson would still have a mandate to remain as Prime Minister. So if we're looking into his mind, maybe the idea is, well, I stay in position. The problem is that obviously with a reduced minority, you're risking more legislative deadlock. And right now, even with a huge majority that the Conservatives achieved in 2019, they're not necessarily getting through many of the changes that they promised. Housing, for example, there's pretty much no time now before the next election to get through major housing reforms, and they were sort of put in the bin, basically,
yes,
on the previous minister. That's just an example of something that has been. So with a reduced majority, things like that will definitely not be happening. But Boris Johnson would probably stay in number 10.
Well, one other option, which we'll get to, is that Johnson stays until 2024. But just on the current polling, Savanta Comres has Labour on 42, Conservatives on 31, which is not a kick in the bottom away from where Tony Blair was relative to John Major in 1997. The difference, of course, is where the boundaries currently lie. Even with an 11-point lead such as that would only be a majority of about 24 for the Labour Party, and that's at the upper end of their expectations at the moment, isn't it? The most likely outcome, perhaps, is that Labour emerge as the largest party, depriving Boris Johnson of his majority, but not winning one for themselves.
Absolutely, and that would be, especially with the resurgence, of course, of the SNP over the past few decades in Scotland, would be a really interesting position for Labour to be in. If the Lib Dems gained a lot more seats from the Tories, there could be a position where Labour and the Lib Dems work together on certain things, or maybe even a coalition, though the leaders of both parties have sort of rubbished that idea for now.
Yes.
That's a possibility. The SNP question is, of course, a big one. It's one that was used as a threat by the Tories in a lot of previous elections. But
that's a reason, isn't it, for the Labour Party to be much more publicly open to the idea of working with the Liberal Democrats, because the Liberal Democrats don't pose an existential threat to the country in the way that a separatist party like the SNP do. Yeah,
absolutely. And it would be interesting to see how they go forward, of course, with Sir Keir Starmer at least outwardly appearing to be a lot more moderate than, say, Jeremy Corbyn and his wing of the party. But, of course, with many of the Labour grassroots still sort of on that more far left side, if they would still be supportive of Starmer if he chose to work with the Lib Dems, though, of course, if he did choose to, he would already be in government by then, probably. So yes, they wouldn't necessarily have a choice. But huge implications for the future of both parties, really.
Well, the other possibility is, of course, that Boris Johnson stays in power until the end of 2024, which is the last possible point at which he could go to the country. That would be 5 years since the election in 2019. I think actually that period, for various reasons related to holidays and such like, it maybe slightly drifts into 2025, but that's essentially the latest point, roughly 2.5 years from now. He could still be there as leader. He could be clinging on at that point. And one of the possibilities you raise, of course, in your piece is that Keir Starmer might not be leading the Labour Party. If he does receive a fixed penalty, he has promised to do what everyone said Johnson ought to have done when he received his, and resign from his leadership role. So it's not impossible to imagine a scenario in which the greased piglet continues to evade capture and Keir Starmer is no longer the leader of the Labour Party come the end of 2024. That's not impossible.
Yeah, absolutely. And if Keir Starmer was essentially forced to step down by his own standard, it'd be a really interesting place. I think even speaking from a non-partisan stance, I think there's possibly more talent on the Labour front benches, people who would more fit the leadership than there is on the Tory front benches right now. People like Lisa Nandy, other people who served in previous shadow cabinets. Maybe people who could connect, people like Yvette Cooper, maybe connect more with those red wall seats compared to Sir Keir Starmer, not through want of trying, obviously, but a lot of people, when they think of him, they note sort of a lack of charisma, an ideological fuzziness that maybe a new Labour leader would be sort of better at polling on with the public. In terms of Boris clinging on, I mean, it's definitely a possibility. It could even be the most likely possibility because, you know, journalists always get excited by all these different possibilities, but it could be, you know, it's just the most obvious or the thing that we thought would happen, that he's just going to stay until the next election.
Well, that's interesting because at the end of the conversation, I wanted to just quickly run through the four possibilities that you've outlined. Johnson stepping down, which we don't think is going to happen. The 1922 committee changing the rules. Johnson calling an election, or him staying until 2024. And I promise not to play this back to you in a couple of years, but
oh gosh,
and I think you've rather preempted the question. You think that maybe, on balance, Johnson staying until 2024 of those four possibilities might be marginally the most likely?
So I think that if there was another no confidence vote, if there was a rule change, or even if it was after 12 months, I think if he lost it, which is, I think there are factors that could mean he loses it, such as even worse polling, that kind of thing, or if, let's say, if any major scandals erupted, he would obviously go.
Any more scandals erupted?
Even worse things, who knows at this point. In the autumn, especially following those by-elections, and of course with the Standards Committee investigation into him, if he's found to mislead Parliament, I think that could lead to a big groundswell of disappointment from MPs, and it could lead to him being ousted out by his own MPs. However, if he does cling on, I think, which is also probably about 50-50 maybe, or 60-50, if he does cling on to 2024, the Tories are going to have a very hard time at that general election because they've been in power for well over a decade by then, and by now even. We have soaring prices, a poor housing market, and of course the Partygate scandal, even though it's not necessarily a legislative issue, though it's seen as them breaking their own legislation. I think it's something that is going to be absolutely great for Labour and the Lib Dems to sort of put on posters and talk about. And the ministers and Boris Johnson himself can't get away from it because they have either justified or sort of excused it as not that big of a deal, or they played a part in it.
There is an option 5, of course, isn't there, which is that the Standards Committee find that he has misled Parliament and choose to sanction him with a suspension from the House of more than 10 sitting days, which I think is the trigger for a recall petition, potentially. So it might be the case that his electors in Uxbridge and South Ruislip get a chance to kick him out of the Commons before the rest of the country has its say.
Yeah, that is a possibility, and that would be a very interesting one.
Yes.
It's very difficult to know how the committee will rule. We know that I think Harriet Harman has been put in charge of it because Chris Bryant was judged to be sort of too involved.
Well, he recused himself, didn't he?
Yeah. He's been too involved in commentating on it, basically, to make a judgment. Though Harriet Harman is, of course, you know, a Labour grandee. She's certainly not going to pull her punches with Boris Johnson. So it's certainly a possibility. Though, you know, if they did choose to do a smaller suspension, which is very common, then it would be a very, very bad PR, but it wouldn't lead to a recall petition.
Georgia, thank you very much. Georgia Gilholy is a reporter with politics.co.uk.